He's on our side, and that's all that matters. For this first chapter, I'm going to tell you a sometimes ridiculous but true story about how a large segment of Nazi Germany's wartime intelligence apparatus influenced U.S. policy for decades after the war. It begins with John Boker, a captain in the U.S. Army who was assigned to evaluate German POWs as potential intel assets on the Soviet Union. In June of 1945, Captain Boker arrived at the von Bergen House in Wiesbaden, known as the General's House by the American occupation forces because several high-ranking German prisoners resided there. Boker was there to meet with General Reinhard Gehlen, formerly head of the eastern section of the Abwehr, the German Army's intelligence branch. It was suggested that he had a vast trove of information on the Soviet military and was willing to make a deal. Many German officers were trying the same thing to avoid the building war crimes cases. I should note here that Gehlen wasn't personally accused of war crimes, nor were any of his subordinates. They were analysts and paper shufflers, data crunchers. But the methods that other people used to extract the data that they worked with were often severe. As Christopher Simpson says in his book Blowback, which is one of the earliest works on this subject, Gehlen's officers were scientists in somewhat the same way that concentration camp doctors were. Both groups extracted their data from the destruction of human beings. The guard out front told Boker that Gehlen was upstairs, somewhere. It was a very casual prison environment. Captain Boker and his aide, Lieutenant Comstock, found Gehlen still asleep. Boker's report doesn't specify what time this was, but it was definitely not some pre-dawn rousting. So the general wakes up in his boxers like some frat bro late for class, gets dressed, and goes out to the terrace to talk about Russia. The main thrust of the conversation is that these Soviets are brutes and savages. They're going to turn on the rest of the Allies as soon as they think they can win, and he wants to help America beat them. To that end, he explains that he and his team have buried a vast trove of information covering every aspect of the Soviet military machine, and he wants to give it all to the United States. Further, Gehlen explains that he still has a network of informants inside the Soviet-controlled zones of Germany and Eastern Europe. Now, Boker was not a fan of the Russians either, and he thought that they at least needed to check this out. But they were going to need a little bit more manpower to work all the leads. So Boker and Comstock bring in Lieutenants Landauer and Bautzen, both of whom were fluent in German. Now they've got a little posse going to do the footwork. Because, you see, Gehlen didn't hide all these records himself. Most of the document caches were stashed by his men, and in order to recover them all, Boker's team first has to get the men. Classic quest design here. This posed some difficulties. Not only were war crimes investigators roaming around the country snatching up German officers and at least once inquiring about Gehlen himself, but also some of them were prisoners in areas under British control. As Boker himself said of the matter, "Rather than attempt to source these men through regular channels, I decided it would be best to go out and get them for various reasons." This involved taking things up the chain of command a ways to Colonel Philp. The colonel decided that the whole endeavor was worthwhile, and to help things along, he pulled Gehlen's name from their list of prisoners so no one would come by looking for him. He also authorized Boker to write whatever orders you need in order to take custody of the others without having to file formal requests and bring in all kinds of scrutiny from politicians and careerists that still thought Stalin was their buddy. Over the next 2 weeks, we were able to get most of the men, and through them the documents which they'd hidden across half of Germany. Most of the documents. Some were in the process of being transferred to the British, but those boxes were intercepted before they could be hauled away. Another crate was already in British custody. Now, if Boker were to call them up and say, "Hey there, chap, I was wondering if you might be willing to hand over this box of papers and microfilm. Oh, nothing too important, but there's a bottle of Kentucky bourbon in it for you," then he runs the risk of it turning into a big requisition with paper trails and awkward questions. So instead, they drove out there with orders to pick up an odd assortment of items, including a Cyrillic printing press. You know, things that'll take a while to load into a truck, giving Boker and his team time to look around. Perhaps you are familiar with the time-honored military practice of strategic transfer of equipment to an alternate location. Yeah, Bautzen and Landauer stood guard while Boker and Comstock loaded the crate into a truck and drove away with it. I imagine with big grins on their faces. So by mid-July of '45, they'd collected most of Gehlen's documents and staff. The group put together some reports on Soviet capabilities and intentions. Colonel Philp came over with some wine. It was a good time all around. I want to stress what's happened here. This wasn't generals in DC deciding to grab a few German officers and put them to work under strictly controlled circumstances. This was mid-level American officers forming a working relationship with their German counterparts, acting independently on their own initiative, and creating a new organization blending goals and methods of both parties. As it works its way up the chain through colonels to generals and finally to DC, it's also growing and developing its own identity. It's a case of cultural diffusion. And it's here where Lieutenant Colonel Gronich gets involved. Gronich called Boker in for a meeting in Frankfurt, and he recommended that all the documents be shipped to Washington. Well, separating the documents from the team struck Boker, Philp, and the rest of them as a rather boneheaded move, and they argued as much, in more diplomatic terms, I'm sure. There was a lot of back and forth, and it looked like Gronich was going to get his way. But as Boker's later report states, Lieutenant Comstock had close connections to then Senator Thomas of Oklahoma, and he had agreed to permit me to rely on these connections. A senator sorta kinda outranks a light bird, so this bought them some time. At this point, the whole thing has become essentially a little intel agency jointly staffed by German and American personnel, operating out of a house, like a spy fraternity. Meanwhile, the few people that knew about it were haggling over what to do with them. Finally, they get word from the War Department, things were named a bit more honestly in those days, that the documents and the men were to be sent to P.O. Box 1142. It was the code for the interrogation center at Fort Hunt in Alexandria, Virginia. Boker thought that was some bullshit, so he drove up to Frankfurt to see if he could get General Siebert riled up enough to quash the whole thing. But the general couldn't overrule the Secretary of War, though he did apparently gripe that Gronich had pulled a fast one. Okay, if that's how the game's going to be played, then they could play too. They left one man from Gehlen's staff behind to maintain contact with an operative that they weren't officially authorized to contact, but had unofficially informed to chill while they get it sorted out. They also left Lieutenant Comstock behind and arranged a code so they could keep in contact without the War Department knowing what they were up to. And so in August, they packed up a bunch of documents and German officers and went to America. But as usually happens when the Army handles the travel arrangements, it was a complete mess, and the documents got sent one way, the Germans got put in solitary cells, half the American interrogators didn't want to talk to them, and the rest didn't know what to ask. Boker played musical colonels for a while until things got sorted out. He eventually sold the intel guys on the project, and Gehlen's group was set up in a barracks to continue sorting out their data. So now the United States Army had its own Nazi spy ring. Gehlen's network, by this time operating under the name Operation Rusty under the overall supervision of the previously mentioned Colonel Russell Philp, was proving to be very expensive. So much so that the Army kept trying to pawn it off on the Strategic Services Unit of the OSS. On top of that, several Germans involved were openly claiming to be working for American intelligence and engaging in all sorts of black market activities that drew unwanted attention to the program. And what would the Soviets think if they ever found out? Well, we know because they wrote about it in Pravda. Recently, an espionage body was discovered in the Soviet occupation zone in Germany. It was headed by Herbert Pinkert, formerly a colonel in the German army and commander of a regiment in the Brandenburg Special Duties Division. On Pinkert's admission, he is a member of an illegal fascist organization in the Western Zone consisting of officers of the former German army who are employed by the American intelligence for espionage in the Soviet Union. This only fuels tensions between the two power blocs and also perversely makes the illegal fascist organization more valuable because the need to get info on the ground intensifies. The funding issues and lack of security gets us into the intense rivalry between the Army's intelligence service and the Office of Strategic Services, a rivalry which really should be covered as its own sordid and absurd topic. But the short of it is that after the war, they were fighting over a shrinking pool of funding, and they weren't both going to make it through. Colonel Grombach, head of a secret military intelligence group known colloquially as the Pond, and also incidentally an Olympic boxer, went hard after the OSS, portraying them as being infiltrated by communists and Soviet agents. This was easy enough to do since the OSS did downplay evidence of Soviet war crimes, for example the Katyn massacre in Poland, in the interests of Allied solidarity. and eventually, to no one's great surprise, the OSS was shut down. But the post-war world wasn't as peaceful as everyone had hoped, and the need for an independent intelligence agency was recognized. This led to the Central Intelligence Group, which quickly transitioned into the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947. The new CIA took over responsibility for Gehlen's organization, though with some reluctance for a number of reasons. A station chief in Germany, whose name is redacted in the declassified report, stated this: "The political implications alone, leaving aside the espionage angle, would come in handy if the Russians at any time should look for a pretext to provoke a showdown in Western Germany." More to the point, both in terms of provocation and the question of institutional culture, were the political implications of sponsoring an organization which, in the opinion of qualified observers, constitutes a reactivation of the German Abwehr under American aegis. The entire arrangement was once described as the United States being like a rich blind man using the Abwehr as a seeing-eye dog with a very long leash. And while all of that was going on, the Gehlen organization was expanding its network of agents. And who are Nazis going to hire? Well, more Nazis, of course. But no worries, the US government made them pinky swear not to employ SS men, no SD or Gestapo, only good, clean-cut German boys that like baseball and apple pie. So guys like Emil Augsburg, who ran a special task group in the Russian front. Special tasks is a euphemism for mass murder. And Franz Six, who was a law professor and one of the organizers of the Wannsee Institute. Did you ever see that Kenneth Branagh movie, Conspiracy, where a bunch of guys sit around a table and politely discuss industrial genocide? That Wannsee Institute. This network consistently delivered raw data and analysis for their US handlers, with very little oversight. According to some accounts, the organization's reports were occasionally just retyped on CIA letterhead and given to the president without further comment. And the raw data that they delivered, observation of the disposition of Soviet forces, reports on what was being shipped where along their railroad network, that sort of stuff was very good. But the analysis that they provided with it was of dubious value. Now, say that you think the Soviets might be getting ready to sucker punch Western Europe, so you pay a bunch of guys to keep an eye on them. They want to keep getting paid. You see the problem here. Gehlen and his organization not only had an obvious animosity toward the Soviet Union, but they had a financial incentive to inflate the threat. In a few short years, the Army's initial assessment of Soviet forces in Europe being overextended, under-equipped, and bogged down with occupation duties, while they tore up German rail lines and factories as war reparations to send back to Russia, was replaced with a story of 200 Red Army divisions massing for an assault into Western Germany that could come without warning. The missile gap, another staple of the early Cold War, was fueled by the Gehlen organization, which dutifully provided alarming fragments of data to support the worst-case scenario conclusion. During this time, Gehlen had a close working relationship with Allen Dulles, one of the key figures in the CIA, who would go on to become the agency's longest-serving director. We'll talk about his antics in another video. For now, just know that they were tight. There are a number of ways this distorted intel influenced national policy, and it's important to note that they weren't just making things up. They started with assumptions of Soviet intent based on their wartime experience with the Red Army destroying their country and not distinguishing themselves in the annals of military conduct in the process, and confirmation bias took over. But that doesn't mean it was all innocent error. For example, they had a knack for placing a piece of information in someone else's report. They would then independently confirm it, though there was only the one dubious source. We see the same practice used heavily in mainstream media today. I'm tempted to talk about Gehlen's 1951 visit to America, but it's really more a collection of amusing anecdotes than any real policy impact. For example, they took him to a baseball game. Game 6 of the 1951 World Series. The mental image of a Nazi general cheering on the Yankees with a hot dog in his hand is of no historical value, but it somehow captures the essence of this entire chapter. This isn't just some bit of Cold War excess that burned itself out. In 1949, West Germany became a sovereign nation, and in 1954 it joined NATO. In 1955, the occupation officially ended, though to this day there are still a lot of American troops in Germany. At this point, West Germany was a real country, a NATO ally, a partner in the struggle against global communism. Which meant that they needed their own intelligence agency. The Gehlen organization was given this task, transforming into the Federal Intelligence Service, or Bundesnachrichtendienst. Gehlen served as the agency's chief until retiring in 1968, having made a lasting impact on not only the policies of the United States and NATO, but on the institutional cultures of their intelligence-gathering agencies. So with this first chapter, I started with a fairly well-known and documented incident. Some of the future ones will be a bit more strange and obscure, unless, of course, nobody wants this content, in which case there may not be any more for quite a while. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and also I want to extend a thanks to all the supporters of the channel over at Patreon and Ko-Fi. You are the primary motivating force here.